Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds of global climate negotiations.
Yeah, specifically looking ahead to COP30 in Brazil later this year.
Exactly. And sort of the groundwork that was laid, or maybe the disputes that arose at the recent SB 62 meeting in Bonn.
Right, the subsidiary body meeting, always a key moment before the main COP.
And our goal here is to understand why these talks seem so tangled up, with things like finance structures, geopolitics, stuff that doesn't always make the headlines.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just setting emissions targets.
So let's start with the big one from Bonn, climate finance. It sounds like a major point of conflict.
Oh, definitely. You have developing nations, climate justice groups pushing really hard for more public money.
We're talking big numbers, right? Like $1.3 trillion.
That's the figure being pushed for, yeah. And that's on top of the $300 billion agreed last year at COP29.
Wow. Okay, so that's a massive jump. How are developed countries reacting?
Well, the sources say they're resisting that figure. They're leaning much more towards promoting private funding instead.
Okay. And do the sources explain why? Why the preference for private funding, or why is 1.3 trillion seen as, well, too much from public sources?
Yeah, the argument often boils down to scale. Developed nations tend to argue that, public budgets alone just can't stretch that far.
Yeah.
And they see private investment as, well, more scalable, maybe more efficient for getting projects off the ground quickly.
But the source material seems critical of that whole structure, doesn't it? It mentions something about the way funding works.
Exactly. It's not just the amount, it's the mechanism. The sources describe the current system as fundamentally flawed, even using the term neocolonial.
Neocolonial, that's a really strong word. What does that mean in this specific context, according to the source?
Well, it suggests the system kind of mirrors old power dynamics. The argument is that the funds provided often end up serving the donor country's own interests.
How so? Like their foreign policy or business interests?
Precisely,
Right.
or their strategic goals. And crucially, the conditions attached can actually hinder the receiving countries from building up their own capacity, their own self-reliance.
So it might mean funding projects that require, say, using companies or tech from the donor country.
Yeah, that's one example often cited. Instead of truly empowering local sustainable solutions, it can end up reinforcing dependency.
Yeah.
It's framed as a kind of economic control rather than genuine partnership for climate resilience.
Okay, that adds a whole other layer to the finance debate. Beyond finance, though, what else does the source say is holding back climate action?
A big theme is the impact of growing conflict and sort of a breakdown in global cooperation multilateralism.
Right.
And it poses this really tough question. How effective can collective climate action possibly be when you have major geopolitical tensions and wars?
Like the example given of the Israeli war in Gaza.
Exactly. The source notes the huge environmental costs. There are millions of tons of CO2 generated, apparently, but also how conflicts like this and the war in Ukraine just seem to erode the very cooperation needed for climate talks.
It seems like narrow political or economic interests just take precedence.
That's the argument. They override these collective challenges.
Does the source put a number on the environmental impact of military activity overall, globally?
It does, and it's pretty stark. The global military sector as a whole is estimated to contribute around 5.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions.
5.5%. Wow. How does that compare?
Well, think about it this way. If the world's militaries were a single country, they'd be the fourth biggest emitter on the planet.
The fourth biggest. That's staggering. You really don't hear that figure discussed much in the context of climate solutions.
Not often enough, no. And then there's the spending aspect. Between 2021 and 2024, global military spending reportedly jumped by $454 billion.
$454 billion. I mean, compare that to the climate finance figures we were just talking about.
Precisely. That amount alone could make a huge dent in the climate finance gap that developing countries are pointing to.
So you have this paradox then.
A very stark one. The source describes wars and militarism as profitable, particularly for arms producers, many based in the global north.
Right.
These major military powers are increasing their spending, even while claiming there aren't enough public funds for climate action. U.S. and European companies dominate the arms market revenues.
So the profitability of conflict itself might be diverting resources and attention.
That's the core argument presented, that these profit motives can actually sort of rewire global priorities away from long-term survival threats like climate change, undermining the multilateralism we need.
So bringing it all together, What does this suggest? If immediate crises and maybe the profits from conflict can overshadow collective action?
Yeah, what does that tell us about our ability to tackle a slower but just as existential threat like climate change?
And it makes you think, what role is there for those movements from below? The ones linking climate justice with wider economic and social issues, demanding change when the official negotiations seem so stuck.
Definitely something to mull over.
hmm
Where does real change come from when the top-down system seems so constrained by these other forces?
A lot to think about there. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.